Okay, this is our review video. It's going to go unit by unit, and you don't have to take notes or anything unless you want to. Just like usual, I won't be checking anything, but this is just to help you. So if you have any other questions, please post them on the Edmodo page so that other students can see them, because that will probably answer some questions for everybody. If you have a question, someone else probably does too. So just keep that in mind. Okay, first unit, Mesoamerica. Even before we start with Mesoamerica, in early America, the early nomads traveled from Asia over the land bridge to Beringia to the Americas 40,000 years ago. Now the reason why they did this is because they were hunter-gatherers, so they were nomadic, so they had to walk around and follow their food source. So when their food source traveled across this land bridge, they also went across this land bridge. But as soon as they got over, well, not really as soon as, they were nomadic in North and South America, spreading all the way to the tip of Argentina, all the way from Alaska. And finally, gradually, they began to settle. Now, this is known as the Neolithic Revolution. So one of the characteristics of the Neolithic Revolution is that humans turned from hunter-gatherers and nomads to settled civilizations. So this meant they needed to domesticate their animals, and they also needed to began to farm and have stable agriculture and stable food sources. So thousands of years after that, three Mesoamerican civilizations developed: the Maya, Aztec, and the Inca. The Maya were located in Central America, so Guatemala and Nicaragua mostly, underneath or south of Mexico, and that was earlier than the Aztecs, from about 200 to 900 AD. The Aztecs were after the Maya, but they were fairly similar to their predecessors, and they lived in central Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula, which is that little part that sticks out on the eastern coast of Mexico. And they survived from 1100 to 1500 AD, and the Inca were located more in South America, so specifically Peru and Ecuador, from 900 to 1500 AD. So Inca and Aztec were contemporary. They were around the same time, and the reason they ended around the same time is because they were colonized by the Spanish, and we'll get to that at Unit 6. So specifically, the Mayans were characterized by many city-states who traded and cooperated with each other. They also developed one of the first writing systems where hieroglyphs represented words. So these hieroglyphs were used on the Mayan calendar, which you might remember. That was the first 365-day calendar that is very similar to the one we use today. They used one that was 365 days for farming and one that was 260 days for religious purposes. And part of their religious beliefs were that they believed in many gods, and so they practiced human sacrifices to demonstrate their respect towards these many gods and also to please them, because they had one god pretty much for every part of life. So they had a rain god and a land god and a sun god. So they would have to please these different gods, and they believed that if they sacrificed part of their own to show that they were humble or lesser than the gods, then the gods would be pleased and do good things for them on earth. So the Aztecs were characterized by one king who managed the entire empire. So whereas the Mayans were many different little city-states who all worked together and traded, the Aztecs had one king over the whole thing. And they built their civilization on Tenochtitlan, which was in the middle of the lake. And so it had a very swampy terrain. And so one characteristic of the Aztec civilizations is they had these floating gardens called chinampas. So these chinampas were floating gardens. They were man-made islands, sort of, and because there was so much water around them, they needed to use their land like this in order to farm and grow. They also practiced human sacrifice for the same reasons, to please their gods. And the Incas were kind of a hybrid politically of the Maya and the Aztecs. They had one king who managed the whole empire, but under that, they had different city-states that were managed by someone else. So this was more sort of almost like feudalism. So these many city-states were connected and could communicate from this huge, very advanced road system that was 24,800 miles long. And this road system allowed these city-states to communicate, to trade, and also to remain politically connected by that one common king. And the road system also allowed for an advanced military. So the army could be stationed throughout the empire and be deployed very quickly in the case of an attack. Also due to their mountainous geography, so because of the mountains, they needed to build these roads so that they could be connected, but also due to the mountains, they also developed terrace farming, such as Machu Picchu, which terrace is those steps in the side of the mountain. So it kind of looks like little steps where on each step they grow a different row of crops. Okay, Unit 2, Ancient China. Ancient China was ruled by dynasties, which, so the leader, or the monarch, I guess the ruler, he would be the head of the dynasty, and then when he died, his son would take over, and when he died, his son would take over. So these long string of dynasties that were connected by family lines. And they all justified their power with adherence to the mandate of heaven. Some important dynasties for the final exam and to know for their overall historical significance is the Qin dynasty, who was ruled by Shi Huangdi. So Shi Huangdi ruled the Qin dynasty, and after the Seven Warring States, when China was ruled by 7 different families, Shi Huangdi first united China under one China. That's what it's called, China, because it comes from the word Qin, Qin dynasty. And so Shi Huangdi was the one to build the Great Wall of China to keep out the Mongol invaders to the north. And he was a very strict, authoritarian ruler. So he ruled using one of the philosophies, legalism. The Han dynasty was the dynasty right after the Qin, and they invented paper. And the Tang dynasty came after the Han dynasty, and they invented gunpowder, which is a crucial invention in the history of different civilizations. So because of their trade with Europeans knew about gunpowder. Because of their knowledge of gunpowder, the Europeans were able to conquer the Aztecs and the Inca in the 1500s. So 3 different philosophies influenced the political, social, and cultural life in ancient China. The first is Taoism, which means the way, literally. So the way of nature is what it refers to. And followers of Taoism believe people should listen to nature and not disrupt the natural state of things with their own actions. So they shouldn't take action if it goes against the natural state of nature. It's a very passive philosophy. So this focused on maintaining the balance of nature, which is symbolized by the yin and yang. That's that circle with the black and the white. And that refers to the light and the dark of the world balancing each other out and maintaining perfect balance throughout their natural state of being. So Taoism is kind of the passive one. Then we have a positive one and a negative one. The positive is Confucianism, and this is named after the founder, philosopher Confucius, who believed that people were naturally good, and so they should base their lives off 5 key relationships in life. And if a person maintains these 5 key relationships in good stead, then society can function fluidly. So the 5 relationships are parent to child, older brother to younger brother, friend to friend, husband to wife, and subject to ruler. Now the last one is legalism. So this believes that people are naturally evil, and so a strong government is necessary to control those natural evil tendencies to commit negative acts. So a ruler needs to be authoritarian and strict in order to properly rule his society. Unit 3, the rise of Islam. Islam is a monotheistic faith which was founded by the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad was a merchant from Mecca, and as soon as he heard the word of Allah from the angel Gabriel, he traveled from Mecca all throughout Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula and spread Islam throughout his life. And because this came in conflict with the polytheistic beliefs of the tribes in the Arabian Peninsula. He was actually exiled from Mecca, where he was born, and had to live in Medina. And because Medina was the place where he was exiled and Mecca was the place of Muhammad's birth, these are the two holiest cities of Islam. And Jerusalem is also involved as a holy city because they do have a deep-rooted history. There are two holy books to the Islamic faith, the Quran and the Hadith. The Quran is the words of Allah exactly as they were said to Muhammad, and the Hadith is the narrative of the life of Muhammad. So one is verbatim what Allah said to Muhammad, and it's no quotations, no elaborations, it's just directly what Allah said to Muhammad. The second is more like what we think of as the Gospels. So Muhammad did this, and Muhammad did this to the people of Arabia, etc. So Muhammad led the Islamic faith as caliph until 1610 when he died. So then after he died, it's called the Sunni-Shia split. The Sunni-Shia split was these two groups emerged of his followers that believed two different people should be the next caliph. The Sunnis believed that Abu Bakr, who was a close friend and follower of Muhammad, should become the next caliph. And these groups still exist today, and they make up 85% of Islamic followers. The other group believed that Muhammad's son should become the next caliph, and so that it should follow a bloodline of Muhammad, and this makes up now about 15% of the faith. 5 pillars govern the beliefs of Islam. There is Shahada, which is the testimony of faith, so there is no God but Allah. Salat, which is the ritual prayer 5 times a day. Zakat, giving approximately 2.5% of one's earnings to the needy, otherwise known as charity. Psalm, which is fasting during the holy month of Ramadan. And the Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in a lifetime. There's another belief of Islam, which is called the jihad. This is not a pillar of Islam, but it's just another belief. So there are 2 interpretations of jihad. The greater jihad is the internal struggle against one's own natural temptations and desires that go against Allah. So this is dealing with, that little voice in your head that tells you to do things that Allah says are sinful. This is the greater jihad. Some extremists, however, interpret jihad as the lesser jihad, which is the outward struggle, and so this outward struggle is to defeat all opposition to Allah's will and to Islam. So this is what Allah wants you to do. He wants you to attack or defeat or eliminate all opposition to Him as Allah and Islam as a faith. So extremists use this as a justification for terrorist attacks. They believed something was sinful and they were trying to eliminate it on behalf of Allah. That is the extreme interpretation, but most people define jihad as the internal struggle against your own temptations. Unit 4, Ancient Africa. So ancient Africa is characterized by a wealth of resources and wealthy kings, as you probably remember. Very wealthy civilizations, very advanced. And the 2 resources that were most important to ancient African civilizations were gold and salt. So this gold-salt trade across the Sahara Desert led to the development and advancement of the Kush, Ghana, and Mali civilizations. Salt, however, was important to all civilizations around the globe because salt preserves meat. So Africa had a ton of salt because the Sahara Desert is a desert, so it doesn't have water. So this salt they were rich in it, and they could use that to trade for other things to gain them resources of other kinds that they needed. Now, gold was important because they had so much of it. Mansa Musa, who was a ruler of Mali and the richest king who ever lived, some say, he was very influential. He converted to Islam, and so most of North Africa still is Islamic and believes in Islam. And he went on a Hajj, and because he was so rich and so faithful and so influential, he gave away so much of his gold on this Hajj to Mecca that the global value of gold was reduced, because when everybody has something, not as many people want it, and they will not pay as much for it. So the global value of gold was reduced because of Mansa Musa. Unit 5, Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages is the general term for the era in Europe between the fall of Rome in about 450 AD, and the Renaissance, which is in 1450 AD, so about 1,000 years. So this was one of the main characteristics of the Middle Ages was feudalism. So feudalism, as you probably remember, is the hierarchical social system. Hierarchical means there are different levels, where money and land was exchanged for protection, labor, and goods. So you might give money to the class above you in exchange for protection or in exchange for land. For instance, the peasants or the serfs were at the bottom. There were the most of them, and they had the least power. So they paid taxes and they labored the land in order to stay on this safe land. This was a very dangerous time period. So in order to have the protection of the knights, they would pay them a tax. So the knights' responsibility was to protect the fief, but they could also earn wages. But they also paid a lot of their wages to taxes to the noble. So they paid the nobles, but the nobles essentially let them live on the land in order to protect it for free. And then the nobles governed a plot of land known as a fief, and they managed the taxes of that fief and the exchange of goods on that fief in exchange for power. So the king would give a noble a plot of land, and the noble would give the king all the taxes from that land, basically, and also the king would benefit from the protection of his kingdom by knights. And so the king, going down, would give land to the nobles to manage that fief, and they would collect all the taxes, and he also has final say in the law of the kingdom. So he has ultimate power. And so he got a little out of control during this time period. And so the nobles decided in England in the 1200s that they needed to solve this problem. So they drafted the Magna Carta and signed the Magna Carta. And so this put limits on the king's power. And this was really the first government document that gave somebody other than a monarch political power. So now the nobles had a little bit of political power, but knights and serfs really didn't have any political power either. But the king also gained all the lands produced on the fief. He gained all the taxes that would be exchanged on his roads or in his kingdom, and he gained the protection of the knights. So he was really living the good life. The other group that was extremely powerful during this time period was the Catholic Church, and they were almost more so powerful than the king. So the king worked very closely with the Catholic Church, and the king needed the support of the Catholic Church. Otherwise, they could throw him out of power, support a different monarch against him, something like that. So one of the things that the Pope did to try to gain more followers from about the 1100s to the 1300s was wage crusades, or these military campaigns or holy wars against this growing Islamic empire. So he wanted to demonstrate that the Catholic Church was more powerful than the Islamic Empire, which was a political and religious empire at this time. And he wanted to take back the holy city of Jerusalem and make it the Christian holy city, because Jerusalem is important to all three major monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So that's why the Crusades were fought. Also in the 1300s, the bubonic plague, which is also known as the Black Death, killed about a third of the population of Europe, or 25 million people. So it was a fairly significant event that shifted trade, society, sanitation, etc. So after all this kind of darkness and violence, there was a rebirth of culture, and rebirth translates to Renaissance. And so this was characterized by lots of art and music and education, and two main belief systems led to the Renaissance. There was the belief in humanism, which is the belief that humans were powerful and independent creatures. So they weren't just dependent on God's will. They could act on their own and have their own decisions, and so they should be celebrated and appreciated too. Think about the celebration of the human form in religious art. So even though it's religious, it's still celebrating the fact that people are the ones making actions on earth. The other main belief at this time is secularism, which is emphasis on the non-religious. So this does not mean anti-religious. This just means separate from religion. So think about politics. It's not against religion, it's just separate from religion. So humanism and secularism led to, and the corruption and overall power of the Catholic Church led to Protestantism, and this is known as the Protestant Reformation. And this starts when Martin Luther, who was a Catholic monk, wrote his 95 Theses that spoke of his dissatisfaction with the Catholic Church. So he wrote up these 95 Theses, he nailed them to the cathedral door, and basically chaos broke loose, and all these different factions developed of Protestantism. So because of the printing press and because of the corruption of the Catholic Church, his ideas had great appeal with the masses, and they were able to spread all over Europe. So all these different sections of Protestantism developed in addition to Catholicism. So there was the Catholic Church, and then there were all these other churches, which today are things like Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, those kinds of things. All right. So after the Renaissance, the Europeans begin exploring in the 1400s. So there were three reasons why they explored in the 1400s: glory, God, and gold. Glory, meaning more power and cultural influence throughout the world. God, to spread their religion and to gain more followers of that religion. And gold, to gain more land, resources, and a new group of people to sell their goods to. So they established political and economic control over the New World, which become the American colonies. And this led to an interaction between the New and Old World. So the New and Old World exchanged goods, ideas, resources, diseases, those kinds of things. That's all called the Columbian Exchange after Christopher Columbus. So, for example, of resources, the Americas received horses from Europeans, and Europeans received corn from the Americas. Now they both have those things. However, diseases also spread, which killed much of the Native American population, and Europeans introduced slavery to Americas. So first they enslaved Native Americans, and then they imported African slaves. This also led to the development of mercantilism. So this is an economic system that is based on the colonies providing raw materials for the mother country. So in the mother country, they would use those raw materials to make finished goods and sell the finished goods back to the colonies at a higher price. So really, the mother country wins out here, and the colonies lose out here. So the mother country sells more than it spends. The colonies spend and don't really sell anything at all. So the colonies exist solely for the economic profit or economic benefit of the mother country. So as I mentioned a couple slides ago, Europeans established these slave systems throughout America, the North, Central, and South Americas. So throughout the new colonies, they established slavery. And they took slaves from Africa and imported them to North, Central, and South Americas. Most of these slaves came from West Central Africa, which is where the Portuguese-controlled ports were, though these ports also sold to British ships, to French ships, to Spanish ships. And they also disembarked mostly in Brazil, which is also controlled by the Portuguese. So there are two differences here between the regions of slavery. In North America, they received an equal ratio of male to female, and because of this, more slaves were able to be born, and they had to import fewer slaves. Slave trade was also internal then. In South America, not only, but mostly young males were imported to work on the sugarcane plantations, which was very hard labor, so they only took the most fit slaves to do that labor. And so because there was not an equal ratio of male to female, fewer slaves were born in the colonies, so they needed to import more slaves.